All right, so last but not least, I think, is our post detail component and the not found component. So let's do those briefly. In the post detail component, let's pop that open. Oh, we got a lot going on here. Wow, quite a few things. Well, first let's handle those imports. Great, those look good. Import stars input from components. This looks nice. Okay, now let's also go ahead and import the use auth context from contexts auth. Cool. Now this user is needed here, so let's go ahead and change that up and say const user equals use auth context. Not user auth context. There you go. And there we have it. Let's make sure nothing broke there. Cool. That makes sense. And then we can head back into the app component right here and remove all references to user. Ta-da! Amazing. Okay, still working. Feel good about that. Last but not least, let's head into the not found component. See what's up there. And we actually are not using anything here, so this doesn't need either of those. Funny enough. So let's get rid of everything here. And bam! We've now removed literally all references to user. I mean, do we even need the use auth context hook at this point? I guess we need set user, right? But why? What do we need set user for? Well, we need it for this use effect hook here, right? Well, there's a few things we might need. Like we could keep this, we could take this use effect hook maybe and just like migrate it. We could move it somewhere where the set hook already exists, and then we wouldn't need to use set user at all, right? In fact, let's try it. Let's take this use effect hook here, and let's move that into the auth context. Let's drop it in right here. Since this provider is only mounted once at the very beginning of our application in our app container, this use effect hook will still only be called once, and all we need to do is import this use effect hook here, and we need to import the API client. And now, and remember, this is just a component. This auth context provider is just a component. And so we can call this use effect hook directly in it, and there's really no difference. And now instead of doing it in the app, we can just get rid of this entirely and say, hey, you're gone. Which means, do we still need set user somewhere? Let's see. Yeah, we're still using the handle logout. So let's do the same thing here. Let's take this handle logout function, and let's also move that into the auth context. Cool. Great. Now, we need a set error function too. You know what? I'm going to get rid of that error for now. Let's save it for later. And then let's just take this auth value, and let's put it down here, and let's also expose the handle logout function so that anyone who is a consumer of this provider has access to the user, the set user handler, and this handle logout handler. And if we do that and we save this, cool, still an error here, but what that means is that in our nav bar, we no longer need to accept handle logout from our app. We can just extract it directly from context, and this component no longer needs any props either. So that back in our application, we could say, hey, guess what? No need for you. You don't exist anymore. And that means we don't even need the use auth context hook in our app, which is good because there's no reason to use a context in a component that's a direct descendant of the provider itself. I mean, you could, but it's not quite that as useful. And now, let's save it. Everything seems to be working just as before, and that is exactly what we want. So, looks like everything is good. We can still click on stuff. Hey there. Still knows who I am. We can still go home. We can still check out other stuff. Maybe I can rate this fancy workstation. 9 stars. Cool. Still saves my rating. Fantastic. Everything still seems to be working just like we want it to. I mean, it can't get much better than that. This is great. So, now, having said that, basically what we've done is we've taken our previous architecture. Let's look at the previous architecture. And we have entirely reworked this into a new architecture. So we've taken all of this and we're no longer passing any of those props here. That new architecture can be found in this also poorly done diagram. I'm not a designer, let's say. I am not an architect. I am not an artist. But I've done my very best to redesign this with the auth context in place instead of the previous design, which is this, where all of the data flows directly from this app down to wherever it needs to go. Instead, we have this auth context here that is rendered inside the, well, it's part of this use auth context hook that any component can use to consume it, and I've relabeled those as red, so you know that the prop is coming from the auth context. So now this app component, it's rendering its components, but it's passing very few actual props to any of the components. In particular, there's no prop drilling. We're not passing a user to the home component, and then to the new post form component, and to the post component. Anyone that wants access to that user just takes it directly from the auth context. And so this just simplifies our lives a little bit. It makes sure that if we want the data, our component just asks for it and it gets it. And that's really all we want to happen here. So we're still passing props around, but they're much fewer props, and our components are leaner, and they're still fully functional. So now, the question is, like, when do we use context? Like, why don't we just use context for everything? And that's like, when do we use context? When do we stick with local state? And that's like a really good question. Like, what's the point of context? Is like, why do we even have local state if we can just use context everywhere? And there's actually a place where context doesn't make sense. Like, sometimes we actually do want to stick with local state. And context is, again, primarily used for state that needs to be accessed by a number of different components at different levels of nesting. Authentication state, in particular, is a really good example of that, because pretty much every component in our app needs to know about a user. But as the React docs point out, and they do point this out about context, is that every time a provider component like this re-renders, all consumer components are re-rendered also, even if they don't necessarily need to. And essentially that's saying that, like, this component here, anytime this value changes right there, anything that uses this use auth context hook automatically re-renders. And what I mean by re-renders is that, at least the way React works, and this is explored more in the rendering elements, and you can check that out here in the main concepts, rendering elements. The way React works is that React objects or React elements are just plain objects, and they're cheap and easy to create. And so React stores this version of all of the data and elements in this React DOM, which is known as like the virtual DOM. And so React runs a diffing algorithm to determine exactly when components should re-render. So this register component here, it renders once, and then there's no reason for it to keep running this function and updating the DOM a million times. It just does that once unless the data inside this component changes, and then it re-renders so that it can display the new and updated DOM with whatever data has changed the component. Now, with context, that works the same way. So we have this provider here, and the same thing happens. Like, this renders once, and then it's fine. However, there's a difference in that any child of the provider that is subscribing to this value inside the auth context here, for instance, say like post detail subscribes to it, anytime any of the value inside this context object changes, it forces all of the components that subscribe to it to re-render. And so if these values are changing a lot, if this changes a ton, we're going to cause a ton of unnecessary renders in our application, which, if you get a lot of that happening, it could slow down your app pretty quickly. And so with React context, like, every time this context value doesn't triple equals the previous version, any component that's calling use auth context hook will automatically render. Now, for us, that's not quite important because, like, this rarely changes. The user changes once, really. The set user function is declared and it's always the same. This handle logout function isn't changing. But we do have to be conscious of the fact that, at least, like, hey, if we have a value in context that's changing pretty rapidly, it could mess up our application. So it's at least important to be aware of that. Not mess it up, but like cause your app to re-render a bunch of times. And that can slow things down, lead to poor performance. People will not want to use your app. So at least you have to be aware of some of the caveats. And if you want to know what they are, honestly, just check out the advanced guides, go to context, and find caveats. So it'll talk a little bit more about that. And there's actually some great discussions in the React docs and on the GitHub page about how to avoid that pitfall of context. But in general, the situation that we've created is a perfect example for context, which is that almost every component in our application needed access to user, and now we are providing that through our auth context. And so with all of that work out of the way, let's go ahead and commit our work. Say git status, git add, git dot, git commit, refactored app to have all components pull user from auth context. And we are good to go.